bring in now Salman Shaikh, who's founder of the Shaikh Group. You're a former UN official with extensive experience in the Middle East and working with the UN. There have been a lot of grim firsts in this war so far in terms of the extent of the civilian casualties and the destruction in Gaza, but also some firsts diplomatically and politically. I mean, this kind of groundswell of support for the Palestinian cause, of rejection of the Israeli warfighting policy, of isolation of the US. I mean, is this something you've seen before on this level?
Not at this level. This is unprecedented. The fact that you've had a UN Secretary General invoke Article 99. I work for UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. He didn't do that. And then the votes that we are now seeing in the Council show progressively that the US is becoming more and more isolated. I believe we'll probably have a larger number of countries than the 121 who voted last time for a humanitarian truce in October. So this should be deeply worrying for the Biden administration, and it's very late in the day given the thousands and thousands of people that have been killed in Gaza and the children, and the fact that we don't have the hostages out yet. But I think it's time that the Biden administration started to change course, and very quickly. And in terms of the momentum, in terms of the build-up of pressure, I mean, there's no, as Kristen was saying, no kind of legally binding consequence of such a vote. But do the sheer numbers, the sort of expressions of change of policy from the Biden administration, do they lead to suggest that there could be some change sort of brought about through this mechanism? Well, they didn't put guardrails on Benjamin Netanyahu at the start of this, so now it's going to be very difficult. It's a situation which is going to only get worse. And, you know, when we look at the rest of the world and what we hear is that the damage may already be done. It may take Washington a very long time, let alone an Israeli government, to convince people that they are seriously working towards a brighter future, a peaceful future when it comes to Israel and Palestine. Nevertheless, again, I think the Biden administration has to understand that Benjamin Netanyahu really doesn't have a plan. I believe that President Biden said that Netanyahu has to change. Netanyahu doesn't change. Netanyahu is an Israeli politician who survived at the top by being the craftiest of them all. So for that reason, I think they now have to themselves start to impose a plan which is about having a transition in Gaza and where the killing stops first and foremost, which is why today they could send a signal, at least abstaining, and telling Benjamin Netanyahu that now we're moving gears.
Is that a realistic proposition? I mean, they have tabled this amendment, sort of instituting a criticism, condemnation of Hamas and its attack on October the 7th. Is that likely to be voted through by the other members? And if so, where does that leave the US? Does it then have to shift its position?
I guess the other members want to keep the focus on the humanitarian ceasefire. Of course, one should condemn the actions, the terrorist actions which happened on October the 7th. But there is a place for that, and there is a place for insisting on a humanitarian ceasefire. Because what is the UN telling us over the last couple of days here in Doha? We've heard the UN Secretary General, we've heard the head of UNRWA, as well as other officials telling us we can't carry on our operations. And even if some aid gets in, which is not getting in fast enough, if we reach that breaking point, which I guess we're already almost there, where they can't actually administer that aid throughout the Gaza Strip, then I'm afraid the situation is only going to spiral downwards.
And what does it tell us about the way that the US administration initially tried to handle this, with this very harsh, vociferously expressed expression of support, the close embrace of Netanyahu personally, as well as of Israel, presumably in the intention of then having influence? Now we see this very public division between the two. We've seen, even before this, a lot of reports of US officials being really quite horrified by what's going on and the reputational damage being done to the United States. I mean, where does it go from here?
Well, I know friends and colleagues within the American administration who are actually horrified. But there is a top-tier leadership which has sought to give Israel the green light to go after Hamas, and then who think that they can manage this conflict and taper it down. Unfortunately, they should know that sometimes diplomacy stays behind the curve. And in fact, we're still looking at an escalatory situation, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and in the north of Israel, the southern Lebanon and elsewhere. So for that reason, I think it is absolutely imperative that those in the top-tier leadership, that, let's say it, President Biden, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, as well as Brett McCurk, the man behind the scenes who has the mind meld with President Biden when it comes to Middle East policy in the White House, they now have to look at this very, very seriously. President Biden is talking about Israel losing international support. Well, now they should be focusing on the loss of international support that the United States is having.
Well, yes, I mean, and that could go two ways. It could go against their intentions in terms of bolstering support for the Ukraine war effort, and also in terms of trying to drive this issue with Israel and Gaza. I mean, if they are losing support in the UN at this rate, how much sort of legitimacy and traction do they have in terms of trying to push their own agenda from here on?
I think that's a very important point. You know, the rules-based international order, which the United States was instrumental in creating at the end of the Second World War, is something that rings a bit hollow right now. We have a different geopolitical situation where China and other countries are asserting themselves. Who is now going to listen to President Biden when he calls or states together to distinguish between democracies and autocracies? Look at the Indo-Pacific. There you have 270, 280 million Muslims, where there is an intense competition, particularly with China, but where countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, and with other Muslim minority countries like Thailand and the southern Philippines, who are absolutely upset, angry about the lack of progress towards a ceasefire.
All right, Salman Shaikh, thank you very much for those insights and that experience. Appreciate it. Now.